It is the autumn of 1943, somewhere over the gray and churning waters of the North Sea, and a Focke-Wulf 190 is climbing hard. The pilot, a veteran of the Eastern Front, rotated west for what his commanders cheerfully described as a quieter posting, is scanning the horizon with the trained intensity of a man who has survived long enough to trust nothing. His radio crackles, a voice cuts through, authoritative, clipped, unmistakably German, issuing vectors, altitudes, a bearing toward a reported formation of British bombers. The pilot banks, adjusts his throttle, and follows the instructions without a second thought. He has no reason to question the voice. It sounds exactly like his own controller on the ground. What he does not know, what he cannot know, is that the voice is not coming from any German installation. It is not coming from a bunker in occupied France or a hilltop radar station on the Belgian coast. It is coming from a transmitter on British soil, operated by a small, eccentric, deeply secretive organization that has spent the last 2 years learning to lie in perfect German. The pilot follows the false vectors. He climbs when told to climb. He turns when told to turn. And then, in the cold clarity of 10,000 feet, he sees them. Aircraft bearing German markings, friends by all appearances. And he opens fire. The deception has worked so completely that the Luftwaffe has, once again, been turned against itself. This is not the story of a radar system or a new type of aircraft. It is not the story of a bomb or a gun or any weapon that can be touched or held or weighed on a scale. It is the story of something far more unsettling. A weapon made entirely of sound and trust, wielded from a set of headphones and a microphone in a drafty building on the English coast, by people whose names barely appear in the official record even today. It is the story of the RAF's most audacious deception operation of the Second World War, and how the British learned to use the Luftwaffe's own voice against it. To understand why such a weapon was necessary, you have to understand the particular geometry of the air war over Western Europe in the early years of the conflict. By 1940, Germany had developed what was, for its time, an extraordinarily sophisticated ground-controlled interception network. The system, known broadly as the Kammhuber line, named after General Joseph Kammhuber, the officer tasked with building Germany's nocturnal air defenses, stretched in a great arc from Denmark down through the Low Countries and into northern France, a chain of radar stations, searchlight belts, and flak batteries connected by a web of radio communications. At the heart of this system was something the Germans called the Himmelbett, or four-poster bed, a series of interlocking defensive cells, each roughly 30 kilometers wide, each equipped with 2 radar sets and a ground controller whose sole task was to talk a single-night fighter onto a single target. The system was methodical, disciplined, and brutally effective. In the winter of 1941 and into 1942, RAF Bomber Command was losing aircraft at rates that could not be sustained indefinitely. Some raids saw loss rates of 5, 6, even 7% per sortie. Over the course of a 30-operation tour, a bomber crew's statistical chances of survival were, to use the clinical language of the actuaries, extremely poor. The British response to the Kammhuber line was initially technological. Window, the clouds of metallic foil strips that overwhelmed German radar returns, was one answer, and a devastatingly effective one when it was finally deployed over Hamburg in July 1943. But Window addressed the radar. It did nothing about the radio. As long as German ground controllers could talk to their pilots, they could adapt, improvise, redirect. A controller who knew his radar picture was being jammed could still issue approximate vectors based on visual reports, flak positions, searchlight cones. The Himmelbett was wounded by Window, but not killed. Something else was needed, something that would attack the system at its most human point of failure. The answer lay in a unit that had been quietly assembling some of the most unusual talent in the British military. Based at Kingsdown in Kent, and later operating from other sites along the southern and eastern coastline, the organization known as the Radio Countermeasures Units, or more precisely, the listening and jamming teams that would eventually coalesce under the broad umbrella of 80 Wing and its various subsidiaries, had spent years doing something that sounds almost absurdly simple. They had been listening. Every night that German aircraft flew, British operators sat at their receivers and listened to the Luftwaffe talking. They recorded the phrases controllers used. They catalogued the procedural vocabulary, the shorthand, the particular cadences with which a controller would talk a pilot through an interception. They noted which controllers worked which frequencies on which nights. They began to understand not just the language, but the grammar of German night fighter control. The technical apparatus that made active deception possible was not, by the standards of wartime electronics, extraordinarily complex. The system that became most associated with this work was known as Corona, a name chosen, like most wartime code names, for its complete irrelevance to the system's actual purpose. At its core, Corona consisted of powerful transmitters capable of broadcasting on the same frequencies used by German ground controllers, operated by German-speaking RAF personnel, many of them German Jewish émigrés who had fled the Nazi regime and found, in this particular form of service, a uniquely personal way to fight back. The transmitters themselves were carefully tuned to match the output characteristics of German ground stations as closely as possible. This mattered enormously because experienced pilots could sometimes distinguish a familiar voice from an unfamiliar one, and any anomaly in signal quality might trigger suspicion. The operators had studied their targets with the thoroughness of scholars. They knew the procedural phrases, the standard acknowledgments, the way a German controller would phrase a vector, not as a creative improvisation, but as a precisely rehearsed performance grounded in hundreds of hours of listening. When Corona was activated over a target area, the British operator would wait for a genuine German controller to issue an instruction, then immediately transmit a contradictory one on the same frequency. The German controller would repeat his instruction. The British operator would issue another contradiction, or simply repeat false information with greater apparent confidence. The resulting confusion, two voices, same frequency, both claiming authority, was psychologically destabilizing in a way that jamming alone could never be. Jamming made the radio useless. Corona made the radio dangerous. A pilot who could not hear his controller was inconvenienced. A pilot who could not tell which controller to trust was paralyzed. The Germans attempted various countermeasures. They changed frequencies, sometimes multiple times within a single night's operations. The British monitoring teams, with their receivers already on the frequencies being vacated, would follow. Controllers began using prearranged code phrases, specific words that would identify the genuine ground station to pilots who'd been briefed beforehand. The British, having monitored the briefings through their own intelligence networks, sometimes acquired these phrases quickly enough to deploy them in the same night. Controllers began signing off with personal identifiers, even using their own names. This presented its own tactical opportunity, because German-speaking operators could then impersonate specific, named individuals, a layer of personalization that made the deception still harder to reject. The operational effect on individual pilots varied enormously, as one would expect. Some were alert to the possibility of confusion and maintained strict radio discipline, relying more heavily on their own instruments and the visual environment. Others, particularly less experienced pilots, or those already disorientated by the noise and darkness and the sheer cognitive load of a night interception, were far more susceptible. The documented cases of German aircraft turning onto wrong headings, climbing or descending at incorrect times, or, in the most celebrated instances, being maneuvered into proximity with other German aircraft with lethal results, began to accumulate with satisfying regularity in the operation logs of 80 Wing. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss the next one. The most extraordinary documented incidents involved the manipulation of large formations during major RAF raids. On nights when Bomber Command was sending several hundred aircraft toward targets in the Ruhr or deep into the Reich, the German night fighter response required the coordination of dozens of aircraft, often drawn from multiple units and directed by several different controllers working in sequence. Into this complex, already stressed communications environment, the Corona operators would insert themselves, issuing false assembly points, incorrect altitudes, redirected vectors. A German pilot told to orbit a particular beacon while waiting for his controller to assign a target might be sent to orbit a beacon 40 kilometers from the one the real controller had specified. By the time the confusion resolved itself, the bomber stream had passed through. The psychological dimension of Corona's effect on the Luftwaffe cannot be overstated, and it is here that the weapon achieved something beyond its immediate tactical results. The knowledge that British operators were on your frequency, that the voice you were trusting might be an enemy, introduced a corrosive doubt into every transmission. German pilots began to treat their radios with suspicion. Controllers began inserting verification procedures that slowed their responses. The friction introduced into the German night fighter system was not always measurable in terms of specific aircraft lost or specific raids that succeeded, but it was real, and it accumulated. The Germans could not ignore Corona, and every adaptation they made to defeat it consumed time, resources, and cognitive energy that might otherwise have been directed at shooting down RAF bombers. Germany's own efforts in this domain were not without ingenuity. The Luftwaffe and German signals intelligence had their own listening and jamming capabilities, and British pilots were not immune to the experience of confused communications. German operators made attempts to introduce false instructions into RAF communications, though the structural differences between British and German fighter control. The RAF's system being somewhat less centralized and procedurally rigid, made mass deception of the Corona type more difficult to replicate directly. German jamming of British radio and navigation aids was persistent and sometimes effective. The Knickebein and later X-Jurat and Y-Jurat navigation beam systems used to guide German bombers onto British targets during the Blitz had themselves been subjected to British counter-manipulation, bent, as the scientists called it, redirected to drop bombs harmlessly into open countryside. The radio war was entirely bilateral, and neither side held a permanent advantage. The American contribution to this particular domain was significant, but differently flavored. The 8th Air Force, flying daylight operations, faced a different version of the ground control problem. German fighter controllers directing daytime intercepts against American formations were doing so under very different conditions. Shorter engagement windows, more visual information available to pilots, less reliance on the intimate voice guidance that characterized night operations. The Americans invested heavily in jamming technology and in escort fighter development, and their contribution to the broader electronic warfare campaign was immense. But the specific technique of impersonating German controllers in German in real time, that remained largely a British speciality, an expression of a particular tradition of irregular, intelligence-led warfare that the British had been developing since well before the war began. What Corona achieved, considered in the cold light of historical assessment, was not the destruction of the Luftwaffe's night fighter arm. That arm remained formidable until the last months of the war, and Bomber Command continued to suffer grievous losses even as the electronic battle evolved in its favor. What Corona achieved was the steady erosion of confidence, the introduction of a systemic doubt into a system that depended on trust between pilot and controller. It forced the Germans to invest in countermeasures, to revise their procedures, to train their pilots to question the voice in their headphones. Each of these adaptations had costs. Procedural complexity slows response times. Distrust of communications makes pilots more hesitant. Hesitation at 10,000 feet in the dark, with RAF bombers a few kilometers ahead, is often fatal, not to the bomber crews, but to the intercepting pilot himself. The surviving documentation on Corona's specific results is incomplete by the nature of the enterprise. Post-war analysis suggested that on certain major raids, the disruption to German fighter control contributed measurably to reduced interception rates. Precise attribution is, as always in intelligence history, impossible. The operation did not win the air war. Nothing won the air war alone. But it is striking that some of the RAF's most successful major raids of the Middle War years, those in which the German night fighter response was most disorganized and belated, coincided with nights when Corona was operating at full intensity. For the German-speaking operators who staffed the Corona transmitters, the Jewish émigrés, the linguists, the former academics and businessmen who had made their way to Britain in the late 1930s, the work carried a dimension that extended beyond the tactical. To sit at a transmitter and deceive, in perfect idiomatic German, the military machine that had driven them from their homes and murdered their families was an act with resonances that no operational briefing could fully contain. Several of these individuals went on to distinguished careers in broadcasting and academia after the war. Few spoke in detail about what they had done. The official record, classified for decades, said little enough about them even when it was released. Today, the site at Kingsdown where much of this work was done has largely returned to the unremarkable English countryside it always was. There is no museum, no prominent memorial, no roadside marker. The equipment itself, the transmitters, the receivers, the carefully logged frequency charts, is preserved in fragments in various archive collections, most completely at the National Archives in Kew and in the collections of the RAF Museum at Hendon, where those who know to look can find the operational records of 80 Wing and piece together, with patience, something of what was done. And so we return to that Focke-Wulf 190 over the North Sea in the autumn of 1943. The pilot has acted entirely rationally. He has followed procedure. He has trusted the voice that sounded like authority. And now he is banking away from the wreckage of what he has done, trying to make sense of a radio that is simultaneously screaming with his real controller's demands and the cool, confident repetitions of someone who doesn't exist. The weapon that brought him to this moment cost almost nothing to manufacture. It required no rare materials, no exotic engineering, no industrial supply chain. It required German speakers, a transmitter, and years of patient listening. The Germans spent millions of Reichsmarks reinforcing the Kammhuber line with concrete and steel and the most sophisticated radar technology of the age. The British countered it partly with strips of foil and partly with language. They built a weapon out of trust itself, and then they unmade that trust, one frequency at a time, in the dark, over a sea the Luftwaffe had once thought it owned. There is a lesson somewhere in that arithmetic. Whether it concerns the vulnerability of all systems built on unquestioned authority, or the particular genius of a nation that has always preferred the oblique approach to the direct one, or simply the fact that the most dangerous weapon in any conflict is a convincing lie, the lesson is there, if you care to find it. The voice said, "Turn here." The pilot turned. The Luftwaffe in that moment was fighting itself, and somewhere in a drafty building on the coast of Kent, a man who had once been a schoolteacher in Frankfurt took off his headphones, made a note in his log, and reached for his tea.